Hey, right, I wanted to upload something about this last week, but I was sort of too far into other projects really to be able to do it. I think it's quite fair to say that the electric vehicle bubble has well and truly burst, or at least it's ruptured, and is in a state of terminal deflation. Now, it's my opinion, and, let's be clear, it is just my opinion, that the electric vehicle was chosen specifically because of its high cost and its impracticality in actual use. Governments in various parts of the world don't want to replace the internal combustion engine with something else just as good. They want to get rid of personal transport altogether. And the electric vehicle is the perfect solution for them to do that. They've hoodwinked most of the motoring public into thinking that it's a viable alternative when in actual fact it's nothing of the sort. Now, last week, Rowan Atkinson, a much-loved UK actor, comedian and writer, came under fire in the Houses of Parliament. Well, actually, I think it was the House of Lords, to be exact. Known for his roles in Not the 9 O'Clock News, Blackadder, Mr Bean, and of late, of course, the Johnny English movies, Mr Atkinson, in common with a lot of comedians, is actually a very intelligent man. Now, Rowan Atkinson actually has a degree in electrical engineering and went on to get a further degree in control systems. So I think it's fair to say that he has an above average understanding of what is and isn't possible with electric vehicles. I mean, both EV and battery technology are sort of governed by the constraints of physics. And ultimately, it doesn't matter how far technology progresses, you're always going to be confined by those laws. Now, Mr Atkinson was an early adopter of EVs. Some 18 years ago he bought his first hybrid and then went full electric 9 or 10 years ago. And as a result of that 18 years experience with electric vehicles, last June 2023, he penned an opinion piece in the Guardian newspaper. Now, I read that article. First of all, what surprised me is that the Guardian is very pro-EV. And the article that he wrote wasn't exactly in keeping with the general sort of agenda that the Guardian normally follows, but it was a very sensitively written and well-balanced article, basically pointing out that EVs are not the way forward at the moment. Now, this article coincided with EV sales in the UK not only grinding to a halt, but actually slightly reversing last year. A trend that looks set to continue, and the Green Meanies, or should I say the Green Alliance think tank, got very cross about Mr Atkinson's article. In fact, they went so far as writing a letter to the House of Lords blaming him for the slow rollout of EVs in the UK. Now, the Green Alliance think tank is just a registered charity. They're not an elected body. They're not a publicly appointed organisation to advise the government. They are just a pressure group that puts pressure on our politicians to force policy that, by and large, we don't really want. They have what, in my opinion, is an anti-human agenda. They have an enormous influence on our government, but because of their status, they're totally unaccountable if things go wrong. And when things do go wrong, their first reaction is always to point the blame at someone else, as they've done here, by throwing Edmund Blackadder under the bus. Now, I think it's probably just a sign of the times, but I find it quite incredible that this letter was taken seriously and actually read out in the House of Lords. It's a clear example of the climate change cancel culture in action. They've labelled Atkinson's article as being opinion presented as fact, and that is factually incorrect and has largely been debunked. Well, I'll leave a link to this article in the video description down below so that you can judge for yourself, but what I read was very clearly a sensitively written opinion piece that was clearly presented as opinion and not fact. Predictably, the Green Alliance played the victim card in this letter, stating that obviously Mr. Atkinson's article had had a big impact on the public, and although they had debunked what he'd said, a debunking rarely gets the same sort of coverage that the original article gets. It's gone largely ignored. Now, I actually tried to find this debunking that they drew reference to. I spent a good 40 or 50 minutes searching for it. I think I finally found it, and all it really stated was that Mr. Atkinson was wrong, because it's a well-known fact that electric vehicles have a smaller carbon footprint during their life cycle compared to an internal combustion engine. I mean, it wasn't very compelling. And that seems to be the length and breadth of their rebuttal to his article. Now, obviously, in preparation for making this video, I had to make sure that nothing had changed, because as we know, some London councils last week announced that they were increasing parking charges in certain boroughs of London for larger EVs because of their increased lifetime carbon footprints compared to internal combustion engine vehicles. Since then, it's been announced that certain areas in the EU are also introducing similar higher charges. So, yeah, that didn't really make sense. I wondered if things had changed since I last made a video on this subject, so I decided to do a bit of research, which was a rabbit hole I really wish I hadn't gone down. And what struck me is that there are many different studies and projections that have been carried out on the lifetime emissions of electric vehicles. But although they all come to the same conclusion, oh, you know, they're better than an internal combustion engine car, they all come up with completely different figures. Now, the reason for this is that they all seem to be using completely different parameters and data sets in order to, present the information to you. Some of them don't make it clear whether they're including the sort of manning and the logistics involved in getting all the raw materials together. They don't make it clear sort of what vehicles they're applying the data to. And to be honest, after reading what was probably 8 or 9 different studies on the subject that were in favour of ICE cars being more polluting than electric vehicles, I came to the conclusion that they were cherry-picking data that suited them, quite often just, using theoretical cars that don't actually exist, or at least are uncommon, in order to give an unrealistic bias to the results of the studies. Although there was one study that suggested as, people generally don't do as many miles per year as they used to, if you're travelling less than 4,000 miles a year, even a small EV is more damaging to the environment than a petrol car, because it would take longer for it to offset the larger emissions generated during its manufacture, i.e. it would never realistically catch up to an ICE vehicle. And sort of gathering everything together that I've learned in the last couple of years, I came to the conclusion that there was actually no genuine rock-solid rebuttal on the part of the Green Alliance, which is probably why it didn't have much effect. So they've resorted to what these people always resort to. They've tried to cancel Rowan Atkinson. They've tried to put the blame on him, and I personally think they've made a big mistake in attempting to do that. They've underestimated his popularity, and they've underestimated the common sense of what he's said. They've also underestimated the intelligence of your average man on the street. For the most part, Rowan Atkinson was quite complimentary of electric vehicles, describing them as wonderful machines, but he also expressed that as time has gone on, he had increasingly felt duped by the electric car, in that it didn't really meet the expectations that he'd been given when he'd bought it, that charging was problematic with an insufficient charging infrastructure, running costs were not as low as he'd been led to believe, and that when all is said and done, the environmental cost of these vehicles is actually likely to be higher than it's routinely portrayed to be. And the thing is, although his words sort of confirm it, these are not, strictly speaking, just his opinions. The whole population is waking up to these facts. That's what's shutting the EV market down, not Rowan Atkinson. Barely a week goes past now, and it's been going on for weeks and months, where a major motorcar manufacturer doesn't announce that they're about to pause or shut down EV manufacturing. This includes companies like Ford, General Motors, Nissan, Toyota and Mazda. They're all having to give up on the electric dream. The reason that they've been given for that is that no one wants them. They're losing money hand over fist, with Ford reporting that it's losing $36,000 on every electric vehicle that it sells. Even Tesla, the market leader, has had to start sort of heavily discounting its vehicles over the last year in order to get them to move. The market's reached saturation point, and despite government mandates all over the world forcing the sales of electric vehicles, they're still not selling because they're too expensive, the residual value is terrible, and they're impractical and expensive to run. The Advertising Standards Authority here in the UK just this week forced BMW and MG to remove the phrase zero emissions from all advertisements of their electric cars because they concluded that the phrase zero emissions vehicle is misleading and doesn't take into account the lifetime emissions from cradle to grave. The electric vehicle industry is falling apart, and motor manufacturers have been left to pick up the pieces and bear the brunt of the financial devastation that this ridiculous electric vehicle mandate has created. Most of them, if not all of them, have expressed that going forward they're going to look at different technologies. They're moving away from electric vehicles because they're just not profitable or practical to produce. Now, putting aside new developing technologies like ammonia engines or hydrogen power, one very relevant suggestion that Rowan Atkinson made was that we should be looking more into biofuels. When you think about it, this headlong plunge into electric vehicles that create enormous emissions during manufacture is ridiculous when you could be utilising resources that we already have in making conventional ICE engines run on biofuels, because the internal combustion engine is not the problem where emissions are concerned. It's the fuel that we're using that is the problem. Now, I personally think that the backlash against Rowan Atkinson is not so much what he had to say about electric cars, but the suggestion that biofuel was the way ahead, because when you think about it, it's the most sensible solution. I personally am not a believer that CO2 is a problem, but if it really is a problem, biofuels are the answer. They are sustainable, and if produced properly, they are carbon neutral because they only release as much CO2 as they take up in the production and in the manufacture. Existing internal combustion engines can be made to run on it, so you don't need to create a new resource-hungry technology in order to implement it. You don't need to create a whole new infrastructure to supply it. We already have that. It could be a seamless transition that doesn't affect the motor industry, doesn't affect your average driver, and doesn't have a detrimental effect either on the environment or on the industry that surrounds motoring. And as I've discussed in other videos, harvesting seaweed could even have a positive effect on our marine environments. But like I said, as sensible as that solution sounds, I think that is what has angered the governments and the green lobbies the most, because it's not about saving the planet, it's about getting the likes of me and you off the road. Right, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. I would also appreciate it if you would leave a like and consider becoming a subscriber to this channel if you're not already a subscriber. It does help me out a lot. If you want to help in other ways, you can either thank me through a subscription to my Patreon page or via the super thanks button down below. I am of course going to be back on Friday, so until then please ride safely and I'll see you soon.